It is 9:40 and time for us to start. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Linda Walvoord de Velder. Mic's not on. I'm picking it up with my hearing aids for loop. Are you not hearing it through the mic? Now we are. Thank you, Ken. Ken Chamberlain, our IT expert guru. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Linda Walvoord de Velder. She grew up in Holland. I understand that her father was a minister, Christian Walvoord, named, at Third Church from about 1950 to 1958. So she grew up here and went to some Holland schools for a while. And then being a child of a pastor, I guess once in a while they move away. And I think she moved out east and spent some years in maybe New York, New Jersey area. She came back to Holland to attend Hope College. She graduated. I think she was a member of the Mortar Board, the honorary for women. And she went on to the University of Chicago, got a PhD in English, specializing in American literature and children's literature. And she's written 11 books, most of which are children's books, maybe?
Yes.
Mostly children. Okay, and I sort of became reacquainted with her again when she was back in Ohio. She was taught for a number of years at the University of Cincinnati, one of the branch campuses, and taught children's literature, American literature, and everything else probably that professors are expected to teach, probably some even writing courses as well. And let's see, she came back to Holland after her husband passed away in New Jersey, and has joined Hope Church. She was a member at Third Church, and we lured her here to Hope Church. So we're glad to have her, and I would ask you to simply tell us more about Rosetta. Rosetta, please sit by me.
Thank you, Judy. Is that good? All right. I'm really happy to be here today. This book came out in 2004, and it came from my studies of Frederick Douglass, which I did over a long period of time. And at the University of Chicago, I did a dissertation on the subject of combining his fame as an orator and literary writer and children's books. And so I studied the image of Frederick Douglass in books for children from 1895 to 1995. He died in 1895. And although we don't realize it now, there was a steady stream of books aimed specifically for children and claiming to be biographies, not claiming to be historical fiction or giving the author all kinds of rights to make things up. And it was a very interesting dissertation. I never got tired of it. A lot of people who've done dissertations got very tired of their topic eventually. And I know one colleague from the University of Chicago who literally threw his dissertation into the Hudson River as soon as he was finished with it. But it was an interesting project to do. So as I moved back into college teaching and did all that's related to that, I also continued to find ideas for children's books. Now there's a saying in children's books, if a story is about a bear, bring on the bear. So we're going to bring on the bear and read through this book the way a child would hear it, rather than overwhelm you with background information or remind you of what you already know or don't know about the Civil War era and the lead up to it. Let's just read the book. So this was recorded on the Hope College YouTube channel with me with a reading voice, but we don't have that version today. I'm just going to read it as we go through the pages, and that way I can skip, because we're only going to spend about 15 or 20 minutes really reading through the book so you get the impression. And we have 6 copies that can circulate, so you can share with your neighbor to see the illustrations and see it yourself as you, but maybe one way to do it is close your eyes except for the pictures and just listen to the story the way a child would hear it. Now, Miss Tracy's female seminary wasn't far from our house, but it seemed very far to me. Can everybody see? I wonder if I should. Oh, yeah. All right, now I'll get out of the way. It seemed very far to me. I had to walk there by myself. I was afraid, since all the other students would be white. Papa said not to be afraid of white people, and I was trying hard. I can do this, I told myself. I am brave. What's so hard about walking to school on a beautiful sunny morning? Even though I was already 9 years old, I had never attended a real school before. Now I had to go to school alone. Papa would have walked with me, but he was in Ohio giving a speech. Mama couldn't walk with me either. She was not feeling well this morning. Excuse me, I jumped ahead. Not every page has an illustration, so some of this you'll hear is not on the screen. And besides, I didn't want her to walk with me. People might stare at her dress and her red bandana. They might point at her and laugh. I didn't want my mama to have to see that. Anyway, Mama didn't want me to go to this school or any school. I knew the way perfectly. Only a few weeks before, in August, Papa had taken me down Alexander Street. He had held my hand as we walked to Miss Tracy's fancy seminary. After talking to the principal, Miss Tracy, he had enrolled me. I had taken a test and passed it, showing I was ready. There's nothing to be afraid of, I told myself as I strolled under the shady trees that lined the street, painted houses with big lawns and flower beds spread out around me. I turned the corner knowing Papa had paid the school tuition money. They knew I was coming. I hoped girls my age would be in my classes. It was a little shameful I hadn't been to a school before. That was Mama's decision when I was 6 and 7. Those were the years that Papa was away giving speeches in England. He sailed there after his first book was published. The book told right out what his old slave name was and where he lived and who his master was. Reading all of that, his former master might have found him and dragged him back into slavery. Papa's friends wanted to keep him safe. They persuaded him to flee across the ocean to England and live there for a while. Mama and my brothers and I stayed at home in America, in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Chapter 2, Mama and Papa. During those 2 years in Massachusetts, when Papa was away, we lived in a little house. Mama worked for a shoe factory nearby in Lynn. She kept me at home to help my little baby brothers, Charles, Louis, and Frederick. She would bring armloads of leather and shoe forms into the house. The shoe forms were shaped like different sized feet to make larger and smaller shoes. Mama sat by the window sewing the leather. The factory man also brought a special sewing machine. As Mama used this on the shoes, I made lunch and kept the little boys busy. Mama worked for days. Then she took the finished shoes back to the factory and got her pay. She also got money from the sale of Papa's book while he was away. Sometimes Papa sent us money from his lectures in England. He also sent us letters. Friends had to come and read them to us. I wanted to learn to read and write so I could read Papa's letters too. Mama kept an account book in a drawer and saved every dollar she could. Although she could not read words, she could keep a bank account and was very thrifty. In fact, she was so thrifty that she made all the rugs and curtains in our house. While we lived in New Bedford, sometimes a Quaker lady came to our house. She helped me learn to read, so I learned a little that way. But Mama needed my help, so she kept me out of school. When Papa came back from England, he threw his arms around me and my little brothers. He had missed us terribly. He was very sorry I had not been to school. He wanted teachers to help me with reading every day. He wanted other children to become my friends, including white children. He told Mama he wanted me in a real school, and I would go to the best one. Sometimes I heard them argue quietly about it after I was supposed to be asleep. The next winter, when I was 8, Papa insisted I go away and live with Miss Abigail Mott and Miss Lydia Mott, some Quaker ladies in Albany, New York. They would help me catch up with children my age who went to school. I lived with Miss Lydia and Miss Abigail for several months. My room was quiet. Several other children, both black and white, came to the house every day for lessons. Mama begged to have me come back home, and in the spring, Papa agreed. In April, we moved from New Bedford to Rochester, New York. Papa looked into my going to public school, but he was told I could only go to the colored school on the other side of town. I wouldn't be allowed to go to the public school in our own neighborhood, which was all white. That's why he had me take the entrance test for Miss Tracy's. In Rochester, Papa had a great black, powerful printing press. He was the most famous runaway slave in America. He was the only Negro writer to own a newspaper press, the North Star, in the whole nation. It was published in Rochester and mailed all over the country. People knew our family wherever we went. But what would the white girls say to me this morning when they saw me coming to school? Today, for my first day, I polished my shoes twice. I braided my hair 3 different ways. My mother ironed my blouse. Fine-looking carriages were bringing the white girls to school. These girls wore pinafores and beautiful hair bows. They watched me climbing toward the door. "We heard you were coming," said one girl with red hair. "Are you really going to be with us? Come play with us at recess," said another girl. I was too shy to answer. Was it possible? Was I going to be happy? I continued to climb the steps. Chapter 3. I found the principal's office inside. Miss Tracy was a plain-looking lady. "I see you made it all right, Rosetta," she said. "Just follow this teacher." The teacher led me down the hallway. Girls looked out of the classroom with big windows as we passed by. The teacher opened the door to a quiet, empty classroom. Nobody was there. She pointed to a desk and gave me several books. "You will study these," she said. Then she left me. The room smelled of chalk and wax from the floor. I sat down, feeling butterflies the size of turtles in my stomach. The teacher had left before I could think of anything to say. There had been no time to ask her anything. At first, I sat very quietly. Surely someone else would come soon. Surely I would have only a little wait until they put me in a classroom with other girls. Maybe someone was talking about what class I should be in. A long time passed. Did I misunderstand? No, I was sure I was doing just what the teacher said. I didn't know what on earth to do. I decided I shouldn't go back to the principal's office. I certainly could not leave or go outside. I opened the books. They were very easy reading books. Because the Motts had taught me the letters and their sounds, I could read a little, but I was still feeling the butterflies. After a long time, I heard the sound of feet. Girls were laughing in the halls as they got their coats. They clattered outside to the playground. It was recess time. Miss Lydia had explained that in a real school, the children go outside and play for a little while at recess. I wanted to run or jump rope or swing. My back and arms ached from sitting so long. A teacher came in. "Will I go outside and play now?" I asked. "No, Rosetta, I'm here to look at your work." She opened the book. "Do this page." I felt sad and ashamed. My first day at school was very, very hard. Papa hadn't said I would be all alone, but I didn't cry or argue. I just did the page. When the recess was over and the school was full again, the teacher came back. She looked at my work. She nodded. "Very good. Now you may go outside. It's your turn to play." "But everyone is finished. I won't have anyone to play with." "Never mind that. This is your recess," said the teacher. Under a big tree, I sat on the swing. I saw girls looking at me out the window, and one of them waved. Then a teacher came to the window. She motioned to the girls to sit down. After a while, I was called inside. I found the bathroom and got a drink of water. I looked at my blouse. It was wrinkled a little now, and my shoes were scuffed. Papa wanted me in this school to learn from good teachers and be with other children. He was a famous orator, had written a book, and was an editor of a newspaper, but he had never been to a school a single day in his life. I was practically in prison. What would I tell Mama when I got home? In my classroom, I sat down again and lay my head on the desk to think. I couldn't tell Mama. If I told Mama, she would get mad at the school and would keep me at home. If I told, I'd miss school until Papa returned from Ohio. He'd want me to go back, and I would have missed a lot. My stomach was tied up in knots. I knew already what I wanted to do. I wanted to wait for Papa. He wanted me to be brave. He would help me. He would be home in about 2 weeks. Chapter 4, Waiting for Papa. Those 2 weeks were the longest days of my life. I did not cry to Mama or anyone else. I went to school every day and sat alone in the same room. I went to recess alone and ate lunch alone. Nobody taught me. I heard the white girls chattering and laughing and doing their arithmetic. I used all the courage I had in me. I didn't run away. I didn't cry. I didn't disobey the teachers. And I didn't tell my mother what was happening. I waited for my father. I wanted to do what he expected. And now we're going to skip several pages in the interest of time. Here, as she's waiting, she's trying to keep herself cheerful and occupied by remembering the stories that Douglas had told about how he learned to read. So the story takes a loop here to tell incidents she remembers him telling her about how he learned to read. So we're going to skip over that until Papa comes home. Chapter 5. At last the day came when Papa returned. He burst inside the house with his suitcase and all his papers and belongings. I ran to him and threw my arms around his neck. We all got big hugs and kisses from Papa. Then he took me on his knee and looked into my eyes. I knew the first thing that he would ask me, "How did it go in school, Rebecca?" Rosetta. His eyes sparkled and he expected to hear happy news. I couldn't hold my tears back anymore. I burst out crying. He looked amazed at this. "Why, Rosetta, darling, what on earth happened? What is it, child?" Mama came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "They keep me all alone in a room by myself. No one teaches me. I'm all alone. They won't let me play with the other girls at recess, and I even eat lunch all by myself. I am so lonely." My misery came out and fell into his big arms. "Who did this? Miss Tracy herself?" "Yes, she made me sit alone the first day. Then we shall go together tomorrow, you and I," he said. Papa later wrote in his newspaper, "I was shocked, grieved, and indignant. He felt Miss Tracy had tricked us. She had taken Papa's money for tuition and then not let me into any of the classes. Now they had me in prison in solitary confinement," he wrote. Every girl noticed when my tall, handsome father, Frederick Douglass, came with me to school the next day. We walked hand in hand up the steps to the principal's office. The great lion, Frederick Douglass, would face the little sparrow-like Miss Tracy with her small, pinched sparrow face. Chapter 6. My daughter Rosetta says that she is being kept away from other pupils. Is this true? Papa asked. Yes, it is, was the cool reply. If I had done otherwise, it would have injured my school and its reputation. And how would that be? Some of our families would object if she were in the classes with their children. We are a private school, so we are obligated to observe the wishes of the parents. If you were going to exclude my daughter, you should have told me that in the beginning, he said. Papa's words fell like hammers. He reminded Miss Tracy he had paid tuition like the other parents. Papa sounded very firm. Not a trace of an accent remained in his voice. He sounded exactly like a senator or a congressman. Miss Tracy grew a bit flustered. There would be opposition to your daughter sitting in the white classroom, she said. I don't believe that, said Papa. Let us ask the students, she said. Very well, then I will put the question to them. Come with me, said Miss Tracy. To my surprise, Miss Tracy led us down the hallway. She knocked briefly on the door and faced the surprised teacher and students. Papa and I stepped into the silent room. Every paper was quiet. Every face was quiet. The fall sun streamed through the big windows. Some problems were written on the board. I looked at the faces of the white girls. No one looked uneasy. In fact, some of them smiled at me. Miss Tracy rapped for attention. Girls, Mr. Douglas is here to see if his daughter may be in this class. How many of you want Rosetta in your class? Raise your hands. She folded her arms. The arm of every single girl shot into the air. Miss Tracy thought the girls had misunderstood. No, you don't understand. I said, how many of you feel that Rosetta Douglas should be allowed to come into this class as a pupil? Again, every girl lifted her hand in the air. I do, I do, I do. Miss Tracy grew more red-faced and flustered. One by one, she called on each of the girls. One girl said she did not mind if I stayed. Did you mean to vote so? Are you accustomed to colored children? Miss Tracy demanded. The girl did not answer. Well, where would she sit then? Demanded Miss Tracy. The girls started to compete. Next to me. No, let her sit here, came another voice. Rosetta, sit by me, sit by me. Other hands shot up eagerly. By me. Papa and I looked at each other and grinned. He had told me to trust white people. We would never forget that day. The children's hearts were right, my father later wrote a letter to Mark Twain. Miss Tracy soon recovered. Well, we are not finished with this subject, she said. Chapter 7. That was my last day at Miss Tracy's school, but I didn't know it at the time. The children wanted me, but Miss Tracy wasn't finished. I could have been happy there, but this was 1848, so the story did not end. That evening, without telling Papa or me, Miss Tracy called a parents' meeting. Parents crowded into the meeting room. Papa and I weren't there, but our friends later told us what happened. Miss Tracy asked how many parents agreed that they wanted me to enroll. All the hands went up, except for the hand of one person. And who objects? She asked. Mr. Horatio G. Warner stood up. He was a powerful man. He was the editor of the Rochester Courier, a newspaper with a few hundred readers. Papa's paper, the North Star, which he had started just the year before, was sent all over the nation to thousands of readers. The newspaper published by Horatio G. Warner was local. Papa spoke to big crowds everywhere in the North, and he traveled and wrote books. Mr. Warner was unknown outside of Rochester. Mr. Warner cleared his throat. I do not believe this enrollment is suitable because it betrays the boundaries that society and nature have set in place for the education of our youth, he said. Then he launched into a long speech. Mr. Warner didn't want his daughter to go to school with the daughter of Frederick Douglass. He acted like my father was a paid abolitionist, rabble-rouser, and troublemaker. He said Papa was not really from this city. He had lately come from another state to bother the good citizens of this town. He went on like that. After Mr. Warner's long speech, Miss Tracy took another vote of the parents. Again, all the parents except Mr. Warner voted to have me. Again, all the parents except Mr. Warner voted to have me come to Miss Tracy's female seminary. But Miss Tracy's rules won, and Mr. Warner had won. If there were no objection, I would allow this enrollment, said Miss Tracy. But since there is one objection, Rosetta will not be allowed. I am a good Christian, and I oppose slavery. But the issue before us is another one altogether. I am responsible for a safe, peaceful environment, and this is a threat to our peace. Chapter 8. When Miss Tracy's secret meeting was going on, Papa and I were at home explaining to Mama what a wonderful thing had happened. We thought I was in the school, so the next morning I walked to school as usual with my books under my arm. This time I could hardly wait. But when I reached the steps, Miss Tracy met me there. She must have been watching for me out the window. "Rosetta, you are no longer a student here. Please return home." For a moment, I just stood there. I didn't understand. She had to tell me twice to go back home. I fled so fast that no one could see the tears of shame stinging my eyes. Somehow, I made it home without dropping my books. I rushed inside, hardly able to breathe. This time I told Mama just what had happened. "I knew it," she said. "I knew this would come to grief." She sent a boy from the neighborhood to get Papa from his office. He came rushing home, but by then I had dried my tears and was playing with Louis and Charles. "Will you stay home and play with us now, Rosetta?" my little brother Charles asked. Papa came into the room and gave me a hug. "It's all right, Rosa. It's all right," he said. He called me Rosa sometimes at home. "Will I go to the colored school now, Papa? Will I go where the school board wants me to go?" "No, Rosetta, you will go to the best school we can find." Mama looked sad. She hugged me. "I told you, Frederick, this child does not need to leave home. She needs protection in a home. This is too much turmoil for her young heart." "Rosetta, are you brave?" Papa looked me in the eyes. This time he used my grown-up name. "Yes, Papa." "Do you want to have the best teachers you could have?" "Yes, Papa." "Well then, it is settled," he said. "I'll send a telegram and we shall see." While he was gone, Mama talked to me in the kitchen. "Reading is not the most important thing," she said. "My life is happy, but I don't know how to read. You know your father has tried to teach me. I can't learn. I am happy without reading." "But I know how to read a little already, Mama. In the future, colored children will have to learn." I know, the world is changing, but I want you at home where they cannot hurt you." "Mama, the white girls wanted me. They liked me. I know they did. They even voted against their teachers in order to take me into their class." I know that. "I want to play with them. Wait till they see me jump rope." You are a brave girl. Chapter 9. So Mama's dream that I would never be hurt and Papa's dream that I would make my way into the world were in conflict. Papa sent off a telegram. That afternoon I was so restless that finally Mama let me go down to the newspaper office. Soon a telegraph message arrived for Papa. A messenger in a uniform came to the office to deliver it. I watched as he handed my father the paper. Papa read it slowly and a smile crossed his face. He showed it to Mr. Delaney. "How shall she learn if she's not taught properly?" Mr. Delaney asked. "The Mott sisters are an excellent choice." "Rosetta," said Papa, "I have made some new arrangements. Miss Abigail answered my telegram instantly. You will go to Albany. The Motts will be happy to have you live with them again so that you can go to their school." "Albany is so far from here," I said. "That's right, 225 miles. I will take you on the evening train." He sent a messenger to Mama asking her to get my clothes ready. There was no time to waste. The school year had started and he didn't want me to fall behind. Later, my father would write a public letter in his newspaper. It would be addressed to Mr. Warner. It would explain that after Miss Tracy sent me home, I was welcomed into another school with white children. He pointed out that this happened within 5 hours of my being sent home from Miss Tracy's. That meant Papa had rushed to the telegraph office and heard back from Albany all in one day. He didn't mention in his letter to Mr. Warner that my new school was over 200 miles away. Now from here, the book is going to trace what happens to Rosetta after she goes to Albany and once again lives with the Mott sisters who had, as you recall, taught her the beginnings, the rudiments of reading before. And so she's going to go to Albany and be lonesome for her family, but she'll have a quiet room and she will go to school with both white and black children as the Mott sisters, not Lucretia Mott, but 2 other Mott sisters, not Lucretia. She comes and goes by train for the holidays and occasionally, and within a year or 2, she will come back to her home in Rochester. And I will telescope that because I do want to leave time for discussing the story up to this point. The rest of the book is going to show that Papa's skill at confronting Horatio G. Warner by name in the North Star and writing this story in detail. You might wonder, where did I get these, what people said? You know, you can't make, well, this is historical fiction, so I can make things up, but I had a source for this conversation. Douglas conveyed it in detail, skillfully, the way that this is done. What the children said, what Miss Tracy said, what happened moment by moment to show what happened in Rochester. And what strikes you the most about this story as a story for children, showing them the complexity of this young girl who is, you know, she's, it's 1848, so it's like, what was the year that the first white children were integrated in the South? It was after 1958. It was like maybe the 60s. It was after Brown versus Board of Education, forced integration in the South. And there was spotty integration in the North. It's an interesting detail that in New Bedford, Massachusetts, because it is Quaker dominated, the schools were integrated. So it's possible that Douglas did not expect coming to Rochester to find the situation that he did, because Rochester was thick with abolitionists. It was an abolitionist center, and the Corinthian Hall in Rochester is a famous hall where completely freedom speeches were given, including Frederick Douglass's famous 4th of July speech, was given in Corinthian Hall in Rochester. He may have expected that the white people of Rochester would come through. Well, they did with a vote, but not with any action after Rosetta was shunned away by Miss Tracy's female seminary. So I'm going to leave a few minutes now, and if we have time, we'll read the ending of the book that traces Rosetta's life after this incident as she grew up. He sent her to the ladies' preparatory school at Oberlin College when she was ready, when she was about 16. The normal schools in those days were not actually college, but they were preparation for people to be able to teach in the public schools. So that's the training that Rosetta received for a term at Oberlin College. Then she went to New Salem in New Jersey and lived with friends of the Douglas family, and taught black people in schools in 2 different occasions. She later married a black soldier who had fought in the Civil War, and they had children, and those things are summarized at the end of this book. In a way, one of my challenges as a writer is to decide what is the end of the story. Well, the end of this story is when Rochester integrates its public schools, because in 1854, after steady pressure by Douglas, every year he would go before the Board of Education and say, well, how am I going to educate my children this coming year? Are you ready to open the local schools to my children in the neighborhood where they live? Well, you know, we would be having a lot of trouble, and it took them until 1854 to decide. In the meantime, Frederick did hire a private tutor now that the 3 younger boys were ready to start learning to read. So Miss Phoebe Thayer, a Quaker teacher, came to Douglas's home and was their in-house tutor for a time. He never sent his children to the colored school until Rochester drastically improved the colored school. And when they had devoted more money and facilities to the colored school, then for 1 year, he did send his 4 children, including Rosetta, to the colored school. But he still pressured them about opening the white school. And the next year, in 1854, they did open it. And so Rosetta's younger sister, Annie, did go to an integrated public school in their neighborhood of Rochester, New York, which in a way is the end of the story, that at least it is a token or symbol. Douglas's long campaign had come to fruition, and this is what nonviolent confrontation and the steady nonviolent methods that Martin Luther King and all of the great later leaders picked up in the 60s and marked the civil rights era and became more verbalized, were exemplified in this story. And Martin Luther King does point to Frederick Douglass's papers as one of his serious sources of inspiration as he was studying. So, questions?
Is this a good time to hand out those excerpts, or you want that later?
Yes, we did select select some quotations from the story that maybe you want to zero in on. if there aren't general questions that we need to answer. So we have a little handout here. These are all selected from the story.
Please raise your hand if you have a question or comment, and I'll come to you with the mic.
Barbara.
Hi, my name is Barbara. Have you had experience watching little kids the age that you want to read this book? Have you been in the room and heard or seen their reaction? I'm just wondering, because I was thinking of my nephew's two little girls who are part Chinese, and I felt myself fearful in a way of, they're 5 and 7. I don't know, when do you start saying that people might yell at you? It's perplexing.
I have not actually been present when children in the target age group heard the story. So I can't actually, if any of you have experiences to share with me about how children perceive this or what questions they ask, that would be great. I think that children would just be across a whole big range. And I also think that the age at which parents would choose to read this book to their children would vary a lot. There would be parents who would be ready to read this to a 5-year-old. There would be other parents who would say, oh, no, this is much too troubling. A child should not be troubled with this until they're at least, and then they'd name a figure, like 14 or something, You'd have a tremendous range. And so if you took, this will never be a textbook in a school anywhere, because it would be a book that would provoke disagreement among parents about at what age level it is age appropriate, in my opinion. Now, maybe that's not true. But the copies that circulated, or the copies that did sell, went primarily to schools and libraries. And I don't have any way to track what proportion of the books that sold were privately bought in families by parents. I do have one copy, though, that was a Christmas gift to a child from a family. So somebody's family thought this was an appropriate Christmas gift. And the book is now owned by Amazon, and they have frequently featured it at Christmas time as a story of brotherhood. They do a special little ad on it as a Christmas story, so many people see it as a successful story of Douglas and Rosetta showing bravery to stand for the right, and let the rest just be explained according to the children's understanding.
Jane Dickey, and I taught developmental psychology for quite a few years. I think you have to start teaching this book in preschool, and the reason is that children as early as 3, 4, and 5 are going to hear and see racist comments. And so what you do, and this is true of sexism as well, and heterosexism, is you teach the child a scheme of racism. You teach the child a scheme of sexism. Larry, my husband, and I needed to do this with our children as they'd watch TV. They watched a program about science, and this was a sexist comment. And the PBS person said, what do you think of when you think of a science? Do you think of him, or do you think of him doing this, or do you think of him doing that? And Larry turned to our girls and said, girls could be scientists too. He just doesn't understand. And my daughter said, Larry said something like, he's not thinking with his head. And she said, he's not thinking with his heart either.
All right.
So she was about 5 when she said that. So if you teach children as they learn this, that there's nothing wrong with that child, it's called racism. And so they begin to then identify at a very early age racist comments or sexist comments. But I think you don't wait to 14 because the little 10-year-olds are all going to be exposed to that to begin with.
All right, I guess you have your handout now. Let's take a look at some of these quotations from the text and see what your impressions were in this. Mr. Warner cleared his throat, and the paraphrase here of the defense that Mr. Warner gave. Now, if I did not have Douglas's own representation of this, then I wouldn't have a strong enough ground to really represent what he said. Because even though I'm in Rosetta's viewpoint, therefore I am doing historical fiction, nevertheless, you can't misrepresent what someone said. But Douglass published a fairly detailed account of this in the March 1849 issue of the North Star. And people can, that's referenced in my, as you can see, I added some substantial end matter here to identify where this came from. And teachers or scholars who want to track it can find an account there in the North Star, and also in Douglass's last autobiography he does tell about this incident. And this is paraphrased. Well, I put it in quotation marks, but 2 ways to handle quotes that you are, is paraphrase. If you paraphrase, you're on safer ground as far as being challenged than if you use direct quotes. But I did, for the purposes of this book and what it's trying to do, I'm putting words in Mr. Horatio G. Warner's mouth, but nothing more than what Douglass did himself. And that's why in this, he called Horatio G. Warner a despised minority of one in Rochester, claiming that the majority opinion in Rochester was against Horatio G. Warner, and that the abolitionist sentiment that was spreading across the North was strongly, just virulently opposed to the cruelty that was shown to this little girl. And that she never should have, Miss Tracy never should have admitted this little girl at all. She was being a double talker to take the little girl. And she's certainly being a double talker when she makes her statement about, I am a Christian and I'm against slavery, but I'm not for integration. Now that is a very key point in this narrative too. There were many people in the North who were against slavery. They were abolitionists, whether gradual or let's do it now. But they could not envision an integrated society. And when he began his political career, Abraham Lincoln was one of those people. Abraham Lincoln could not imagine an integrated society in the beginning of his career. But as we mentioned here, Abraham Lincoln was one of the readers of the North Star. And so he gradually changed his mind, because the idea of colonization, if you know what that is, let's send all these people back to Africa where they came from, was not going to work and was not politically viable in this country either. So that, given that, then what are you going to do? The 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to slaves and clarified equal protection under the law, would not come along until 1868. The 14th Amendment wasn't passed until 1868, after the Civil War was over. And that is the monumental constitutional basis for correcting what we see here. But when you think of all that had not yet happened in 1848, it is just stunning that this 9-year-old girl faces this ordeal. How about if there were no objection, I would allow this enrollment, but since there is one objection, Rhodesetta will not be allowed. Now, she makes a big deal about we're a private school, so we can be responsive to parents' requests. Well, can private schools be used as a way to avoid integration? Certainly, this is what happened as a result of Brown versus Board of Education all across the South. There was just a huge proliferation of private schools which were formed for white children only, and so the public system was just left to be the integrated system, and people who wanted their children not to go to school with blacks, regardless of how qualified to go to school those blacks might be, had their means through private schools. But in the North, from what I've read, there were some Quakers and other believers in an integrated society who did insist on forming private schools that were integrated. So New Bedford, Massachusetts, and other places where Quakers were opening schools were not the only place. Another note that I realized in reading about this book, as you can see, the Quakers come off very well in this story. They helped Rosetta, Quaker women helped Rosetta get started. The Mott sisters in Albany were an anchor for her when she needed to go ahead a little bit further. And generally, how many of you are aware that out there in the coverage of abolition and the prelude to the Civil War, Quakers come off well. They have a reputation for having taken a stand against slavery as no other religious group did. However, the Quakers as a whole were stronger on equality of man in the 18th century than they were in the 19th century. There was a definite reversion, and there were many Quakers who owned slaves, including in Philadelphia. And there were many Quakers who said what she is saying. We believe that there should not be ownership of another human being, but we don't believe in integration. And the other truth is that every other Protestant, and I'm sure Catholic, I don't know as much about the Catholic Church, but every Protestant church had its abolitionists within its fold. And there was support for both sides of this in the Protestant churches, Methodists, Congregationalists, Reformed. There were at least 2 Reformed churches in Rochester in 1848. And all around that area, there was presence of old Reformed kinds of families, so Reformed and Presbyterian, and there were a lot of churches in Rochester in 1848. So the churches were, what? You didn't see a massive move of the churches, though, to protect this little girl who had been shunned from the public system. They probably all said, well, we provide a school for you, and it's over there on the other side of the tracks, and they only have crayons and paper, and they don't have any of the teachers or facilities or materials that the white school has, but those little children were not ready for all of that, or they'd find some rationalization about why it's okay to have the separate but equal idea tried out as a rightful and logical excuse, but as we know from the history of our laws, separate but equal doesn't make the cut. It never was actually equal as long as it was separate. And Douglass knew that his dream was an integrated society even long before the Civil War. So he was very much a visionary.
Comment here.
So I'm Dave Myers. What you've described as some private schools claiming the right to discriminate, while others, such as the Quaker school, do not, is in a different sort of way being repeated now in our time, as some private Christian schools claim the right to discriminate against gay people or against gay married people. Calvin and many of the schools, in fact, all the schools of the Coalition of Christian Colleges and Universities claim that right, whereas Hope has said as a Christian school, we're not going to do that for a different set of Christian reasons. So it's sort of private schools, some claiming a right to discriminate and because of who they are, and some disavowing them.
Right. That's a very interesting picture.
Bob Giroux. I think I'm interested in, or fascinated by the fact that Frederick Douglass, who is this firebrand of anti-slavery, has such a powerful, unique story himself, or maybe not so unique, story to share, how he and his wife could be at odds about the education of their daughter. And I mean, you would think that she would be of one with her husband in this area. So I'm wondering if we have a window here on not a black-white issue, but a male-female issue, and that she was evaluating her daughter's future based on the opportunities she saw for an African-American woman at that time in our history, or for any woman at that time in our history.
Certainly her viewpoint that children should be spared this trauma and anxiety is shared by many black parents. So I don't think that Anna Douglas's attitude has disappeared today. I wore a bandana today because someone criticized this book. One of the reviewers criticized this book for mentioning a bandana for Anna Murray Douglass. However, Anna Murray Douglass did wear a bandana and never gave it up and was militant about it. She wasn't giving up her bandana. Now, Anna Murray Douglass was never a slave. Her parents had either gotten or bought their freedom, so she was never a slave. And she grew up in Baltimore, as a housekeeper in very fine houses. So that's how she knew how to make all the rugs and curtains and everything to do for a thrifty house, and how to keep an account book. She was sure of herself enough that Rosetta was one of the people who said, "Mama, that bandana is like, what are you, Aunt Jemima or something?" That idea we would have today, that the bandana is associated with the humiliation of slavery, and nobody does that anymore. That was already in the culture in 1848. And Rosetta, it could be that one reason Rosetta didn't want her mother beside her is because she didn't want the bandana. She wanted to be dressed as much like the other children as she possibly could and let her mother stay home. It's also possible that Douglas and Anna, is your point about how different they were, had agreed that the best way to approach this was low-key, that let Rosetta go by herself and trust that she's not going to meet policemen at the door or somebody trying to shove her aside or protesters or something, like, the parents were justifiably afraid when schools in the South were integrated that there would be protesters and police would be needed to control the mob and everything when she got there. Maybe they both thought that going alone was the best in the situation, that Rosetta was up to it, and Anna Marie didn't want to go there, and Anna Marie was not the person to confront Miss Tracy if that became necessary. So it's hard to suppose that. But anyway, the bandana is historically supported. So.
Mark Hookman. I wanted to just comment, when you were reading the book, it struck me the great strength of it, with children at least, is that you did use the girl's voice, Rosetta's voice, and her fears and determination, and it was just very believable to, I think children would identify with it very, very strongly. And she was just like the other kids, had an emotion and had a desire to do well, and just a child. That struck me as a real strength of the book.
Thank you. I felt that I owe Douglas the debt of having realized the power of this story and told it in detail. And then that to let children step into the shoes of a person in history is the best way to lead them into an understanding of whatever it is they're trying to introduce.
Charity Young, thanks for this, Linda. I'm just looking at the quote in number 4, the last half of it. She's a good Christian and opposes slavery, but this is a different issue, and it's one of a safe, peaceful environment, and how that kind of an argument gets trotted out against whatever the discriminated group is. They're for the people or the cause, but there's this issue of safety or something else, and it just reminds me of Judy Heumann, a disability rights activist who's still living today and was instrumental in the Americans with Disabilities Act legislation, writes, she was born in the late 40s in New York City, in Brooklyn, and in the mid-60s was interviewing for teaching positions. And because she's a polio survivor, and she used a wheelchair almost her entire life, she passed all the exams, the qualifications, interviews to become a teacher in the New York City public school, public education, and they denied her because she was a fire hazard as a person in a wheelchair, which she took to court and won, and made the entire school system open to people with disabilities. But it wasn't that they were opposed to her as a wheelchair user, it was because she was a fire hazard in a school.
A fire hazard. There'll always be a way to find some kind of pretext. Oh, Judy.
Today, the pretext has to be it's divisive, so we can't whatever.
Yeah, and Judy has a comment. The other
It's a
Judy.
Clark.
Another Judy. I was just thinking, Linda, about the power of children's literature and how it has power for children, but it also has power for adults. And I was thinking about a time when I taught a graduate course in bibliotherapy and was just struck by the number of wonderful children's books that are out there that speak to really significant issues. I have a whole collection yet at home of the books from World War II, and both from the Japanese perspective and from the German perspective, and how it affected children. And so I'm just struck by this, your book also, of the power it has, not only for children, but for us as adults, too.
Thank you. And I think the whole American field of children's books, for all the way that we understand that people are trying to ban books and not every book on these subjects makes any sense at all, and people are doing things that they shouldn't be doing and making errors and everything. As a whole, the children's book industry is so prolific, and there are so many people of good education and goodwill trying to do a good job for children, that it is remarkable around the world. There's no other children's book market that's as big as the American children's book market. And as you may know, beginning in the 60s when Congress began funding schools and libraries for children's collections, and therefore the money was there, it just burgeoned. And in many publishing houses, the children's book section was paying for all those godforsaken novels that maybe got a good review, but they weren't even going to sell 500 copies, because a good review, review is a two-edged sword. If the reviewers ignore your book or insult your book, it's really bad, especially the top 4 reviewers. But there are about 4 reviews that pretty much, if you score a decent or good review in any of 2 of those 4, you will sell widely to libraries. So how many libraries do you need? Anybody want to guess how many children's libraries there are in the country? Just take a wild guess. How many children's library collections are there in the country? Like, the statistic that's used to try to estimate that is how many books does the Newbery sell every year? If they're not buying the Newbery, they're not doing much in children's books, right? So how many Newberys sell in the year that the Newbery is won? About 85,000. So that's considered a little bit of a groundwork. How many libraries do you need to have buy your book for the publisher to be encouraged enough to keep doing it? I mean, criticism is fine. It's what's the breaking point where a publisher can make sense out of continuing to do this kind of book? When I was starting out, which was in the beginning of the 1980s, so this is completely different today, but 10,000 would do it. If a book sold out its first printing of 10,000, it would be considered that the publisher would consider doing that type of thing again. And it's not only what kind of wonderful ideas can the authors come up with, but is the publisher taking an extraordinary risk to come out with this book. This book was published by Marshall Cavendish. Marshall Cavendish is an English publisher of primarily reference books, and they had a children's book line that they were trying to get started in the American children's book market. And although they had great editors and tried to do groundbreaking books, they gave it up in about 7 or 8 years. They could not reach those crucial sales numbers to continue it. So now they're again an English publisher. But it's interesting that on ebooks, this circulates well in England. And I've noticed that in the reports. And of course, England, even at that time, loved to say, oh, well, we eliminated slavery in 1842. And here are these Americans who are all head up about, Lexington and Concord and their great freedom battles. And we don't have slavery here. Well, that was pretty interesting because, first of all, more slaves were carted around the world by the British than any other nationality. And Britain never had any slaves at home in Britain. Neither did the Netherlands. At no time did the Netherlands or Britain bring slaves home to their home territory and establish a population of slaves in their home territory. So it's cheap grace to say, well, we eliminated slavery. We eliminated the slave market at a certain point in their territories. in the British Commonwealth, in other words, and, you know, wherever Britain had been in control. But it doesn't mean what some people would like to make of it. Nevertheless, English Quakers were very important friends of Frederick Douglass. They were responsible for buying him from his master for a total of $700 in 1847 and allowing him to come back when he'd been in exile for 2 years after bringing out his first book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. This book is endangered a little bit by all the attention to the life of Douglass, and that was also an editorial and author decision. How much sidetracking am I going to do to bring Douglass's own story into this? And the editors thought it was worthwhile to do a little bit, hence her thoughts while she's waiting for him to come back. But all those decisions play into how it will appeal. So I really appreciate comments that you feel that children can relate to this, because that's where this starts.
Thank you so much. It is time to leave, and I want to have you help me express our gratitude to Linda for this very thorough discussion. We learned a lot. I invite you to come back next week when we have Pastor Jill Russell come to speak to us the first of 2 sessions about her recent sabbatical in the fall, what she learned and what she would like to share with us. So come back again next week. We'll be again meeting in the Commons rather than here. Thank you very much.